When ancient blood demands its debt, love becomes a cage and an enemy. Your only oxygen. Can a heart survive the golden labyrinth of a stolen legacy, where every breath is treason and every touch an inevitable explosion? Witness the transformation as this story unfolds before your very eyes. The dust in the attic of the Granger household didn't smell like memories. It smelled like a lie. Hermione sat on the floor, her fingers trembling as she clutched a heavy cream-colored envelope that had appeared on the vanity the moment her mother's heart had stopped beating in the hospital room 3 stories below. It was addressed to the heiress of the House of Shafiq. Inside, the parchment pulsed with a faint, rhythmic violet light, echoing the heartbeat she had just lost. The truth didn't just hurt, it dismantled her. Jung and David Granger weren't her parents. Her biological mother, a woman named Selene Shafiq, had been a witch of ancient, terrifying lineage. To save Hermione from a father fanatically devoted to Voldemort, Selena had bound Hermione's magic, wiped the memories of a kind Muggle couple, and vanished into the shadows of the war. But magic has a long memory, and the Shafiq bloodline demanded its due. 10 days later, the world changed. The headlines of the Daily Prophet were screaming so loudly, Hermione could almost hear them through the glass of the carriage window. The lost princess returns, Muggle-born heroine revealed as last of the Shafiqs. As the carriage pulled up to the gates of Shafiq Manor, a sprawling Gothic fortress of black stone and ivy that seemed to breathe with the wind, Hermione felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her chest. She wasn't just coming here to claim a title, she was coming to face a ghost. The heavy oak doors swung open before she could knock. Standing in the grand foyer, silhouetted by the flickering light of 1,000 floating candles, was Minister Kingsley Shacklebolt. But he wasn't alone. To his right stood the Malfoys. Lucius looked as though he had swallowed glass, his face a mask of aristocratic pale fury. Narcissa stood rigid, her eyes darting between Hermione and the ancient tapestry hanging on the far wall. And then there was Draco. He looked older. The sharp lines of his jaw were set in a permanent sneer, his silver eyes burning with a hatred so concentrated it felt like a physical weight in the room. He didn't look at her like a war hero. He looked at her like a thief who had stolen his heir. "Minister," Hermione said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous hall. "What is this?" "The reading of the final will and testament of Selene and Corbin Shafiq," Kingsley said softly, his voice echoing. "And the verification of the Eterna Pactum." "The what?" Hermione whispered. Lucius Malfoy stepped forward, his cane clicking sharply against the marble. "A blood pact, girl, made when you were in the cradle, before your mother lost her nerve and hid you among the filth of the non-magical world." Kingsley unrolled a scroll that shimmered with the same violet light as Hermione's letter. Corbin Shafiq and Lucius Malfoy entered into an unbreakable betrothal. To ensure the purity and power of both lines, the firstborn of the Shafiq house was bound to the firstborn of the Malfoy house. Magic cannot be deceived, Hermione. The contract recognized you the moment your biological mother passed. It woke up. The silence that followed was suffocating. Hermione felt the room tilt. She looked at Draco, expecting a joke, a sarcastic remark, anything. Instead, he stepped toward her, his footsteps predatory. He stopped just inches away, so close she could smell the expensive sandalwood and the bitter scent of scorched ozone that always seemed to cling to him. You, he spat, the word dripping with venom. Of all the people in this God-forsaken world, it had to be you. I didn't ask for this, Malfoy, she hissed, her eyes flashing. I'd rather marry a blast-ended scroot. The feeling is entirely mutual, Granger, or whatever you're calling yourself today, he snapped. He turned to the minister, his voice rising. There must be a way to break it. I won't have it. My magic, my name, bound to her? The pact was sealed with a blood sacrifice, Draco, Kingsley said gravely. If either of you refuses the union, or if you attempt to marry another, the magic will strip you of your powers. Within a year, your life force will simply fade. The Shafiq and Malfoy magics are now a closed circuit. You either flow together, or you burn out. Hermione felt a sudden, sharp sting on her ring finger. She looked down and gasped. A thin, glowing band of violet light had wrapped itself around her skin, sinking deep into the flesh until it looked like a permanent scar. Opposite her, Draco let out a low groan of pain as an identical mark appeared on his hand. The repulsion was instantaneous. Hermione backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the manor she had inherited. The cold stone, the whispering portraits, the weight of a history she never wanted. She was no longer Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age. She was a piece of property, a political move made 20 years ago by a father she had never known. I won't do it, she whispered, looking at Draco. I'll find a way. I've solved every impossible puzzle I've ever faced. I will break this. Draco's eyes narrowed, the silver turning to ice. For once, we agree on something. I will spend every waking hour searching for a way to sever this link. I don't care how pure your blood supposedly is now. To me, you are still the girl who shouldn't exist. He turned on his heel and strode toward the fireplace, his cloak billowing behind him. Before he threw the flu powder, he paused and looked back over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Welcome home, heiress," he sneered. "Try not to get lost in the dark." The green flames swallowed him, leaving Hermione alone in the center of the hall. The minister offered her a look of profound pity, but Hermione didn't want pity. She wanted her life back. That night, she lay in a bed that felt like a coffin, surrounded by silk sheets that smelled of lavender and old magic. She closed her eyes and could still feel the phantom heat of Draco's presence. The emotional seesaw had already begun its first slow, agonizing tilt. She hated him. She hated the pact. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, her hand moved instinctively to her chest, where her magic felt different. For the first time in her life, it didn't feel like a solitary spark. It felt like a tether, pulling rhythmically toward the north, toward Malfoy Manor, toward the one person who wished she would disappear. The war was over, but a different kind of siege had just begun. This wasn't a battle for the wizarding world. It was a battle for her own soul. She was Hermione. She was a Shafiq. And she was, by the laws of ancient magic, the property of Draco Malfoy. As the wind howled through the eaves of the Shafiq castle, a single tear tracked down her cheek. She didn't know which was worse, that she was forced to be with him, or that for a split second in that hallway, when their eyes had met, she had felt a spark of recognition so deep it terrified her. Trust was a fairy tale. Safety was a memory. All that remained was the blood, and the blood wanted blood. The first week at Shafiq Manor felt less like an inheritance and more like a slow-motion drowning. Every portrait on the walls, ancestors with hooked noses and eyes like flint, sneered as Hermione passed. They saw her as a changeling, a girl who had spent 17 years pretending to be ordinary, now wearing their crest like a stolen garment. But the heaviest weight wasn't the history of the house. It was the tether. The magical bond was a physical ache. Whenever Draco Malfoy was more than 10 miles away, Hermione's skin felt cold, a persistent chill that no fire could warm. It was the withdrawal the minister had warned her about. The pact demanded proximity. It demanded that the two circuits of magic begin to hum in the same frequency. On the 8th day, the wards of the estate shivered. Hermione was in the library, surrounded by scrolls on ancient blood magic, when the double doors burst open. Draco didn't walk in. He invaded. He looked like he hadn't slept. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his hair, usually plastered back with aristocratic precision, was wind-blown and chaotic. "I can't breathe," he rasped, slamming a heavy book down on the mahogany table. "My magic is suffocating me because you've stayed locked in this tomb for a week." Hermione stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "I'm not the one who walked out through the flu, Malfoy. I'm trying to find a solution. If you'd spent half as much time researching as you did sulking, we might have made progress." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping so close she could see the silver rings of his pupils. The repulsion was there, the instinct to push him away, but beneath it was a traitorous surge of relief. As soon as he was within arm's reach, the biting chill in her bones vanished, replaced by a sudden jarring heat. Her magic reached out for his, and for a second, the air between them shimmered with violet and emerald sparks. "Look at that," Draco whispered, his voice thick with loathing. "Our magic is already starting to recognize each other. It's disgusting. It's like watching 2 predators share a cage." "Then let's open the cage," Hermione snapped, though her heart was racing. "There has to be a ritual, a counterpact. My father was fanatical, but my mother, she hid me. She must have left a way out." Draco's lip curled. "Your mother was a Shafiq. They don't leave ways out, Granger. They leave legacies. My father spent the morning screaming at the ministry, trying to bribe the goblins to let us see the original parchment. It's sealed in a vault that only opens with your blood and mine, together." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He didn't touch her, but the proximity made her breath hitch. This was the emotional seesaw, the terrifying swing from the hatred of what he represented to the undeniable physical pull of the bond. "I don't trust you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't trust that you aren't trying to find a way to kill me and keep the inheritance." Draco let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "Kill you? If you die, I lose my magic. If I lose my magic, I'm a squib in a world that already wants me dead. No, Hermione, I have to keep you very much alive, which is why you're moving into Malfoy Manor." "I most certainly am not." "It's not a request," he growled. "The pact is intensifying. If we don't spend at least 6 hours a day in the same room, the magical backlash will start causing physical tremors. Look at your hand." Hermione looked down. Her fingers were shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't nerves. It was her core, starved for the connection it had been promised 20 years ago. Fine, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. But I choose the rooms, and you stay on your side of the line. The transition was a nightmare of public scrutiny. The press followed her to the gates of the Malfoy estate, cameras flashing as the mudblood heiress entered the lion's den. Once inside, the atmosphere shifted. The manor was silent, Narcissa having retreated to the French estate to avoid the scandal, leaving Draco as the sole occupant of the sprawling, shadowed halls. For the first few days, they lived in a state of tense, frigid silence. They sat in the drawing room, Hermione reading, Draco staring into the fire. The silence was a weapon, a way of saying I am here because I have to be, not because I want to see you. But the trust and doubt cycle was relentless. One evening, as a storm rattled the windows of the manor, Hermione found herself unable to focus on her book. The magic between them was becoming thick, like static electricity before a lightning strike. "Do you remember 4th year?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the gloom. Draco didn't move. "I remember a lot of things. Most of them involve you being insufferable. You called me a mudblood every single day," she said, her voice steady. "You wished for my death. How does it feel, Draco, to know that the very thing you hated is now the only thing keeping you whole?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes dark. "It feels like a sick joke played by a god I don't believe in. But don't act like you're the only victim here. You were the golden girl. You had the world at your feet. Now, you're bound to a Death Eater. Your reputation is burning to the ground every second you stay in this house. We're both being erased, Hermione." For a moment, the cold shifted into something else, a shared bitterness that felt almost like warmth. It was the first time they had spoken without the masks of school-day rivalry. They were just two broken people tied together by a dead man's obsession. "My father," Hermione started, then stopped. "I saw his memories in the Shafiq pensive yesterday. He wasn't just a follower, he was a monster. He wanted to use this pact to create a superline. He didn't care about us, he just wanted a weapon." Draco stood up and walked over to her. He didn't stop until he was standing over her chair. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "We are the weapon," he whispered. "That's what you don't understand. Our combined magic is ancient. It's deeper than light or dark. And it's starting to wake up." He reached out and, for the first time, actually touched her. He brushed a stray curl away from her forehead. The contact was like an explosion. A shockwave of pure energy radiated from the point of contact, shattering a glass vase on the mantelpiece. Hermione gasped, her lungs seizing. The approach was overwhelming. She wanted to pull him closer to see if the heat would finally drown out the fear. But then she saw the look in his eyes, a flash of that old, arrogant triumph. "See?" he sneered, pulling his hand back as if burned. "You're just as susceptible to the power as I am. You don't want me, Hermione. You want the high. You're no better than a common addict." The repulsion hit her like a physical blow. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold so sharp it made her teeth ache. "Get out," she whispered. "With pleasure," he snapped. But as he walked away, Hermione noticed something. His hand, the one that had touched her, was trembling. He wasn't as unaffected as he pretended to be. The emotional seesaw had swung again, leaving them both dizzy and teetering on the edge of a precipice. She realized then That the slow burn wasn't just about love or hate. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of the people they thought they were. By the time this pact was finished with them, there would be nothing left of the girl who lived under the stairs or the boy who lived in the palace. There would only be the bond. That night, the minister arrived. He looked older, his robes heavy with the weight of the Wizengamot. "The will has been fully processed," Kingsley announced, his voice echoing in the cold Malfoy foyer. "There is a final clause, a condition neither of you were told." Hermione and Draco stood side by side, their magic humming in a discordant, angry harmony. "To finalize the inheritance and prevent the Ministry from seizing the Shafiq assets as war reparations," Kingsley said, "the marriage must be consummated and legalized within 3 months. If not, the Shafiq castle will be razed, and the Malfoy name will be stripped of all titles and holdings. You will be outcasts, magicless, penniless outcasts." Draco let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Of course, the final turn of the screw. Hermione looked at the violet mark on her finger. It was glowing brighter now, pulsing like a warning. The conflict had intensified. It wasn't just about their magic anymore. It was about their survival. She looked at Draco. He was looking at her, and for a fleeting second the hatred was gone, replaced by a raw, naked doubt. He was wondering if she was worth the sacrifice, and she was wondering the same thing about him. 3 months, she whispered. 90 days to learn how to love a monster, Draco said, his voice dropping to a dangerous silk-soft register. Or 90 days to watch the world burn. What's it going to be, Hermione? The first part of the middle had ended. The build-up of tension was complete. The golden bond was no longer a myth. It was a ticking time bomb. And as Hermione looked into the silver depths of Draco's eyes, she realized with a jolt of pure terror that she wasn't sure which outcome she feared more. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the Malfoy library sounded like a guillotine. 3 months. 90 days to tether 2 souls that had spent a decade trying to tear each other apart. Following the minister's departure, the silence between them became a living thing, thick and suffocating. Hermione spent her mornings in the West Wing, pacing the length of the sun-drenched gallery, while Draco remained in the shadows of the lower study. But the magic didn't care for their desire for solitude. By noon, each day, the pull would begin, a dragging sensation in the center of her chest, as if a hook were embedded in her heart, reeling her toward him. "Stop hovering," Draco snapped on the 3rd afternoon. He didn't look up from his desk, where he was furiously scribbling notes on a piece of ancient vellum. "I'm not hovering, Malfoy. I'm existing in the same 3-acre radius as you, so I don't collapse from magical exhaustion," Hermione retorted, dropping into an armchair by the fireplace. The approach had been forced, and her irritation was the only thing shielding her from the sudden rush of warmth that flooded her veins the moment she crossed the threshold of his room. He finally looked up. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced, his skin a shade of grey that made him look like one of the marble statues in the garden. "You're breathing too loudly. It's distracting." "My apologies for having lungs," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Perhaps if you actually shared what you're looking for in those books, we could find a way to save your precious family name without the alternative." Draco's quills snapped. He stared at the ruined nib for a long moment before throwing it into the wastebasket. There is no alternative, Hermione. I've looked through the Black Archives, the Malfoy ledgers, even the restricted Shafiq scrolls you brought. My father wasn't lying. The pact is a closed loop. It's a primitive, brutal piece of soul binding. To break it would require a power equal to the one that created it, and that power died with your father. He stood up, walking toward her with a predatory grace that made her pulse spike. The repulsion she usually felt was being crowded out by a strange, magnetic curiosity. He stopped at the edge of her chair, looming over her. The Ministry wants the Shafiq assets. They're waiting for us to fail, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. They want to see the Malfoys stripped of everything, and they want to see the war heroine humbled by a pureblood contract. We are the most entertaining show in London. I am not a show, Hermione hissed, standing up to meet his gaze. She refused to be intimidated, even as the proximity sent jolts of electricity through her fingertips. And I am not humbled. I am the same person I was before I found out my blood was a different color. Are you? Draco challenged, his silver eyes searching hers. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, tracing the air just an inch from her skin. You don't act like a Muggle-born anymore. You carry yourself with the weight of that castle. You look at me with the eyes of a woman who knows she owns half of my soul. You're becoming one of us, Hermione. And that's what scares you the most. The trust she had briefly felt during their talk about her father vanished, replaced by a sharp, cold betrayal. He was trying to get under her skin, trying to provoke the very identity crisis she was fighting to suppress. I will never be one of you, she said, her voice trembling with cold fury. I will never value blood over character, and I will never look at you as anything more than a technicality of my birth. She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, a sudden, violent tremor shook the floor. The windows rattled in their frames, and a low, guttural hum echoed through the stone walls of the manor. Hermione gasped, clutching the doorframe as her magic suddenly flared, turning the air violet. Draco was at her side in an instant. He didn't sneer, he didn't insult her. He grabbed her arm, steadying her. The bond, he rasped. It's reacting to your anger. It thinks we're under attack because our magic is out of sync. Let go of me, she whispered, but her body was betrayed by the warmth. The moment his hand closed around her wrist, the tremors stopped. The house fell silent. The agonizing friction in her core smoothed out into a deep, resonant vibration that felt almost peaceful. They stood there for a long minute, caught in the seesaw. Hermione's mind screamed for her to pull away, to maintain the distance that kept her safe. But her magic was singing, a golden melody that merged with the dark, rhythmic thrum of his. Draco's grip softened. His thumb brushed against the pulse point on her wrist, a gesture so intimate it made her breath hitch. For a second, the mask of the arrogant aristocrat slipped, and she saw the boy who had been forced to carry a mark he didn't want, just as she was now carrying a name she hadn't chosen. It doesn't have to be a war, he said softly, his eyes fixed on her hand. Doesn't it? She asked. How can it be anything else? We're enemies, Draco. We've spent half our lives proving it. Maybe we were told we were enemies, he countered, finally meeting her eyes. By fathers who wanted us to be extensions of their own hate. My father wanted me to be a prince of a dark empire. Your father wanted you to be a bride for a dynasty. Neither of them cared about Draco or Hermione. It was a moment of profound trust, a bridge built across a decade of resentment. Hermione felt her defenses crumbling. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the fear of being erased, and she realized they were more alike than she had ever dared to admit. But then the doubt returned, sharper than a blade. "Is this a tactic?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Are you trying to make me compliant so the consummation is easier for you, to ensure you keep your gold and your manner?" The change in him was instantaneous. The soft look in his eyes died, replaced by a wall of cold ice. He dropped her arm as if it were red-hot coal. "There she is," he sneered, the venom returning to his voice. The brightest witch of her age, always looking for the hidden motive, always assuming the Slytherin is playing a game. "Can you blame me?" she cried. "I can," he snapped, "because I am literally dying for this connection, just as you are. If I wanted your money, I would have found a way to marry Astoria Greengrass and let the ministry have the Shafiq ruins. I'm here because the magic says I have to be, and I was foolish enough to think for a second that you might be able to see past your own prejudice." He turned his back on her, returning to his desk. "Get out, Hermione. Your 6 hours are up for today. Go back to your wing and dream about your moral superiority. It's the only thing you have left." Hermione fled the room, her heart pounding against her ribs. She made it to her bedroom before she let the tears fall. The repulsion was back, but it was directed at herself. She had reached out, he had met her halfway, and she had recoiled out of a fear she couldn't name. As the sun set over the Malfoy grounds, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn, Hermione sat by the window and watched the violet mark on her finger. It was no longer just a brand. It was a heartbeat. The emotional intensity of their encounter had shifted something fundamental. She could no longer pretend that this was just a legal problem to be solved. It was a chemical reaction. A slow-burn fuse had been lit in that library, and no matter how much cold she threw at it, the heat was winning. That night, she didn't dream of the war or her parents. She dreamed of silver eyes and the scent of sandalwood. She dreamed of a golden bond that didn't feel like a cage, but like a sanctuary. In the morning, she found a single flower on her breakfast tray. A white lily, the symbol of the Shafiq house, but enchanted to glow with a soft Malfoy green light. There was no note. There was no explanation. Just the flower sitting there in the silence of the morning. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. The approach was subtle, a quiet peace offering in a world that was screaming for them to hate each other. But as she touched the petals, a sudden memory from the Shafiq pensive flashed through her mind. A vision of her biological father, Corbin, laughing as he signed the pact. "They will have no choice," he had hissed. "The magic will force them to love, whether they want to or not. It is the ultimate trap." The doubt returned with a vengeance. Was any of this real? Were her feelings, the warmth, the pull, the sudden empathy for Draco, actually hers? Or were they just the scripted responses of a 20-year-old spell? She looked at the flower and felt a surge of betrayal. Not from Draco, but from her own blood. She was being manipulated by a dead man, and Draco was her fellow prisoner. The middle of the story was no longer a negotiation. It was a psychological battlefield. Every moment of warmth was followed by a chilling question. Is this me, or is this the pact? She stood up, crushing the lily in her hand. The violet light flared angrily. I won't let it, she whispered to the empty room. I will find the line between the magic and the heart, and if there is no line, I'll burn it all down. The conflict had entered its most dangerous phase. The tension wasn't just between Hermione and Draco anymore. It was between the characters and the very magic that sustained them. As she prepared to head down to the library for her daily sentence with Malfoy, Hermione Granger made a vow. She would find the truth, even if it broke both of them. The slow burn was no longer a metaphor. The fire was real, and it was starting to consume everything in its path. She walked down the grand staircase, her head held high, the cold mask firmly back in place. But as she saw Draco waiting for her at the bottom, his eyes searching hers for a sign of the girl from yesterday, she felt the seesaw tilt one more time. "Ready for another day in the cage?" he asked, his voice devoid of its usual bite. "It's only a cage if you try to leave," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her soul. He offered her his arm, not because the pact demanded it, but as a challenge. She took it, and as their magic merged in a silent, explosive greeting, the second month began. The countdown was moving, and the emotional intensity was about to reach its breaking point. The second month began not with a bang, but with a suffocating atmospheric pressure. The magic was no longer a hum, it was a roar. It lived in the floorboards of Malfoy Manor, it vibrated in the silver cutlery, and it pulsed in the air between them like a heat haze. Hermione found herself constantly breathless. Every time Draco entered a room, the oxygen seemed to vanish, replaced by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the Eterna Pactum. The emotional seesaw was now moving with a violent, unpredictable frequency. One morning, they would sit in the conservatory, the sun catching the white blonde of his hair, and she would feel a surge of warmth, so potent she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from reaching out. They would discuss the nuances of arithmancy, the only safe ground they had left, and for a fleeting hour they were just two scholars, brilliant and synchronized. But then a word would slip, a mention of the old days, a glance at the fading dark mark on his forearm, or a reminder of the ministry's impending deadline, and the cold would return, sharper and more jagged than before. "The Wizengamot sent another owl," Draco said, his voice flat as he tossed a piece of heavy parchment onto the breakfast table. "They want a progress report. Apparently, the minister's personal assurance isn't enough for the committee. They want proof of the bond's stabilization." Hermione didn't look up from her tea. "Proof. They want us to perform for them, like circus animals. They want to know if the Shafiq gold is staying in the vault or moving into the public coffers." Draco snapped, his repulsion manifesting as a sharp defensive edge. "They don't care about the stabilization. They're looking for a reason to declare the pact unfulfilled." He stood up and began to pace. The movement was restless, agitated. Since the bond had intensified, his magic had become volatile. When he was angry, the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen and crawl towards the light. "I can feel your judgment, Hermione," he said, stopping behind her chair. "Even when you're silent, you think I'm just worried about the money. You think I'm that shallow. I think you've been raised to believe that your name is your only worth," she said softly, finally turning to look at him. "And now that it's being threatened, you don't know who you are without it." The trust in her voice was unexpected. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. Draco froze, his silver eyes narrowing. For a moment, the doubt was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "And who are you?" he countered, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. The girl who fought a war for equality, now sitting in a manor built on blood purity, wearing the ring of a girl whose father would have killed her friends without a second thought. "You're a hypocrite, Hermione, and you hate that I'm the only one who sees it." The betrayal stung. She stood up, her chest heaving. "I am trying to survive. We are both trying to survive a situation neither of us created. Why must you make every moment a battleground?" "Because if it's not a battle, it's a surrender," he shouted, his magic flaring. A glass bowl on the sideboard shattered, raining crystal shards onto the floor. "If I stop fighting you, I have to accept what the magic is doing. I have to accept that I don't just feel the pull because of a contract." The silence that followed was deafening. The approach was so sudden, it felt like a physical blow. Draco's breathing was ragged, his eyes fixed on hers with a desperate, localized intensity. He had admitted it. The slow burn had reached the stage where the heat could no longer be attributed solely to the spell. Hermione felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "What are you saying, Draco?" He looked away, the cold mask trying to slide back into place, but it was cracked. "I'm saying that I can't tell where the pact ends and I begin anymore. When you're in the other room, I'm in pain. But when you're here, when you look at me like that, the pain is worse. Because it's not coming from the ring, it's coming from here." He thundered a fist against his chest, right over his heart. This was the internal monologue made flesh. Hermione felt a wave of warmth so profound it washed away the last of her resentment. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and placed her hand over his, pinning it to his chest. Underneath his palm, his heart was racing, a frantic, rhythmic beat that matched her own. "I feel it, too," she whispered. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The trust was absolute. The golden bond between them turned a deep, shimmering honeygold, the air vibrating with a sweet, resonant chord. Draco's hand turned, his fingers interlacing with hers. The violet mark and the Malfoy crest on their hands began to glow in unison, no longer fighting, but merging. But then the seesaw tilted again. A loud, piercing alarm echoed through the manor. The wards were being tested. Draco jumped back, the cold returning instantly. He grabbed his wand from the table, his eyes darting to the window. "Aurors," he hissed. "The Ministry. They're not waiting for the report." "They can't come in here," Hermione said, her voice shaking. "This is private property." "They have a warrant for investigative verification," Draco said, his voice dripping with bitterness. He looked at her, and the doubt was back, uglier than ever. "Did you know? Did your friends in the Ministry tell you they were coming to catch us failing?" "Draco? No, of course not." "It would be a perfect plan, wouldn't it? He sneered, the repulsion returning as he backed toward the door. You play the part of the tragic bride, get me to admit my feelings, and then the ministry walks in to find the bond unstable so they can seize the estate and make you their puppet heiress. How much are they paying you to ruin me, Hermione? The betrayal was so sharp, Hermione felt as if she had been physically stabbed. The warmth of the previous moment was incinerated. How dare you, she whispered, her voice vibrating with power. After everything, after what we just felt, you still think I'm a pawn? I think you're a Gryffindor, he snapped, his face a mask of aristocratic ice. And Gryffindors always think they're doing the right thing, even when they're destroying people. The front doors of the manor groaned as they were forced open. Kingsley Shacklebolt walked into the foyer, flanked by 4 Aurors. Hermione and Draco met him at the base of the stairs, their magic clashing so violently that the portraits on the walls began to scream. "Minister," Hermione said, her voice like a whip, "explain this intrusion." Kingsley looked troubled, his eyes moving between the two of them. "There have been reports, Hermione, anonymous testimony that the bond is being forced, that the Shafiq heiress is being held against her will through illegal coercion. The Wizengamot has ordered an immediate separation and a neutral assessment." "Separation?" Draco laughed, a hollow, jagged sound. "You heard the pact, Minister. Separation will kill us. Or is that the goal?" "It will only be for 48 hours, Kingsley said, "in a controlled environment. If the bond is genuine, it will hold. If it is a product of coercion, it will break." Hermione looked at Draco. He was looking at her with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But she realized with a start that the hatred wasn't for her. It was for the world that wouldn't let them breathe. Or was it? The doubt clouded everything. "I won't go," Hermione said. "You have to," Kingsley said softly. "For your own protection, Hermione. If the public thinks the Malfoys have enchanted you, your reputation will never recover. You'll be seen as a victim, not a leader." "I don't care about my reputation." "I do," Draco said suddenly. He stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. The cold had settled into something stony and final. "Go with them, Hermione. Let them do their little test." "Draco, you'll be in agony," she protested. "I've been in agony since I was 16, he said, his voice dropping so low only she could hear it. 48 hours is nothing. But when you come back, if you come back, I want you to be sure. No magic, no pact, just you." It was a change of attitude so significant it left her reeling. He was letting her go to give her the choice the pact had stolen. The Aurors stepped forward, placing a hand on Hermione's shoulder. As they led her toward the door, the distance between her and Draco began to grow. The pull became a scream. Her skin felt like it was being stripped off, the cold rushing in to fill the vacuum where his magic had been. She turned back at the threshold. Draco was standing in the center of the hall, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. He was clutching his hand, the one that had held hers, and his jaw was clenched in a battle against the pain. "Draco!" she called out. "Don't look back," he commanded, his voice breaking. The doors closed. The carriage rumbled away. Part 4 ended in a vacuum. The tension had peaked and then snapped, leaving them in the repulsion of physical distance. Hermione sat in the ministry cell, luxurious as it was, and felt the silence. For the first time in weeks, she was alone. There was no hum, there was no heat, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. As the first hour of her 48-hour sentence ticked by, she realized that the emotional seesaw had one final cruel trick. Without the magic forcing her to feel him, she was left with the most dangerous thing in the world, her own thoughts. Did she miss the bond? Or did she miss the man? She curled up on the small cot, clutching her hand where the violet mark was now dim and grey. The slow burn had moved from the house to her soul. And as the cold seeped into her marrow, Hermione Granger finally understood the truth. The pact hadn't been a trap for their magic. It had been a trap for their hearts. And as she looked out the barred window toward the north, she knew that the conflict wasn't about inheritance or blood or ministry laws. It was about whether she could survive the 47 hours left until she could see the monster again. The emotional dynamics were no longer about approach and repulsion. They were about the terrifying realization that the repulsion had become the only thing holding her together, and the approach was the only thing that could set her free. She closed her eyes and whispered his name into the dark. There was no answer, only the cold and the ticking of the clock. The middle of the story was over. The build-up was complete. The final shift was coming, and when it did, it would either fuse them forever or shatter them into 1,000 pieces of lead and glass. The war was over, but for Hermione Shafiq and Draco Malfoy, the true battle was just beginning in the silence of their separate cells. The silence of the Ministry's neutral assessment suite was louder than any explosion Hermione had ever survived. Within the first 6 hours of separation, the world began to lose its color. By the 12th hour, the physical symptoms arrived. It started as a dull ache in her joints, then escalated into a shivering fever that no amount of magically warmed tea could break. The auras guarding her door saw a girl suffering from the withdrawal of a predatory contract. They brought her blankets and spoke to her in hushed, sympathetic tones. But they couldn't see the internal monologue that was tearing her apart. Without Draco's magic to push against, Hermione felt like she was evaporating. "Is this the magic?" she whispered into the dark of the 18th hour. "Or is it just me?" The doubt was a suffocating fog. She paced the confines of the room, her fingers tracing the dull, greyed-out mark on her hand. She tried to conjure the memory of her parents, the Grangers, to find the girl who had been content in a house full of books and dental floss. But that girl felt like a character in a story she had read a long time ago. The woman she was now was forged in the fire of the war and tempered by the cold, silver gaze of a man who was currently suffering the same agonizing decay. She realized then that Draco had given her a gift she hadn't asked for, the chance to see the ugliness of the bond without his presence to sweeten it. And it was ugly. It was a parasitic, ancient thing that demanded her life force. But as she collapsed onto the bed, her heart stuttering in a broken rhythm, she realized something else. She wasn't just missing the magic. She was missing the way he looked when he was about to make a sarcastic remark. She missed the scent of sandalwood. She missed the sharp, brilliant mind that challenged her own. The trust that had been flickering in and out of existence finally found a steady flame. Draco Malfoy hadn't set the trap. He was the one keeping her warm while they waited for the trap to spring. The door groaned open, It was Kingsley. He looked older than he had 48 hours ago. "The healers are worried, Hermione," he said, stepping into the room. "Your magical core is dipping into the red zone. Draco is... he's worse. He's refused to eat, and his magic is lashing out so violently the Malfoy wards are starting to collapse. We have to end the assessment." "Did you find what you wanted?" Hermione asked, her voice raspy. Kingsley sighed. "We found that the bond is indeed ancient and unbreakable, but we also found that it's not being forced by him. The resonance frequency is equal on both sides. It's a mutual feed, Hermione. You're not his victim. You're his anchor." "Take me back," she said, standing up on shaky legs. The approach back to Malfoy Manor was a blur of green flames and rushing air. When she stepped out of the fireplace in the grand foyer, she nearly fell. The house felt like it was grieving. The ivy was drooping, the candles were guttering, and the very air felt thin. She didn't wait for the auras. She ran. She found him in the drawing room, slumped in the armchair where they had first argued about the ministry report. He looked like a ghost. His skin was translucent, his eyes closed, and his hand, the one with the mark, was charred, as if the magic had burned him from the inside out. "Draco," she breathed. His eyes snapped open. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but cold terror in them, the look of a man who expected a killing blow. But then, as her magic rushed out to meet his, the change was instantaneous. The warmth was a tidal wave. The colour returned to his face. The air in the room suddenly felt rich and sweet, and the golden bond between them didn't just hum. It sang a triumphant, deafening note. Draco lunged out of the chair, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't ever let them do that again. I'll kill them. I'll burn the ministry to the ground before I let them take you away again." The emotional intensity was at its peak. Hermione wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The repulsion was gone. The seesaw had stopped. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here, Draco." They stayed like that for a long time, two drowning people who had finally found the shore. But as the sun began to set, casting long violet shadows across the room, the doubt made one final, desperate appearance. Draco pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. His expression was a mix of trust and betrayal. "They told me you were free to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "They told me that if you didn't come back by sunset, the ministry would dissolve the Shafiq line and give you a new identity. You could have been Hermione Granger again. You could have been free of the mark, the castle, and me." Hermione felt the weight of his words. This was the final shift. He was giving her the choice one last time, even though he knew it might kill him. "I don't want to be that Hermione anymore," she said, her voice steady. That girl didn't know that blood is just a vessel for the soul. That girl thought everything was black and white. She didn't know that you could find light in the darkest corners of a Malfoy. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "I didn't come back for the castle, Draco. And I didn't come back for the gold." "Then why?" he whispered, his silver eyes searching hers for the lie he was sure was there. "Because the magic might have brought us together," she said. "But I'm the one who stayed. I choose you, Draco, not because of a contract, not because of a dead father, but because you're the only person in this world who sees the girl I actually am." The warmth turned into a slow, deliberate heat. The slow burn was over. The fire was here. Draco's hand moved to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her curls. He looked at her with a look of such profound, agonizing love that it made her heart ache. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not," she whispered, a small, mischievous smile playing on her lips. "But magic cannot be deceived, remember? And magic says we belong together." The conflict, the years of hatred, the months of tension, the fear of the bond, dissolved. There was only the approach. Draco leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I've spent 10 years trying to find a reason to hate you, Hermione. And in 2 months, you've given me 1,000 reasons to love you." He didn't wait for her to answer. He tilted his head and captured her lips with his. It wasn't like the stories. It wasn't soft or tentative. It was a collision. It was the taste of sandalwood and salt, the feel of his magic finally, perfectly aligning with hers. It was the resolution of a decade of war. As they kissed, the violet mark on their hands flared one last time before settling into a deep, permanent gold. The golden bond was finalized. The Shafiq and Malfoy legacies were no longer 2 separate chains. They were a single, unbreakable cord. They broke apart, both of them breathless, the room spinning. Draco looked at her, his face radiant, the cold mask shattered and buried forever. "Happy ending?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Hermione looked around the room. The shadows, the history, the weight of their names, and then she looked at the man holding her. "No," she said, pulling him back down for another kiss. "Just the beginning." The structure was complete. The beginning had set the context of her lost identity. The middle had resolved the conflict of their mutual hatred and the pressure of the ministry. The end provided the outcome, a union built not on blood, but on choice. As the minister watched from the doorway, a small, knowing smile on his face, he saw not a mudblood and a Death Eater, but the most powerful magical alliance the world had ever seen. The Eterna Pactum was fulfilled. But as Hermione leaned into Draco's chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, she knew the truth. The only magic that really mattered was the kind they had built themselves, one emotional seesaw at a time. The story ended with the sun dipping below the horizon, but for the first time in her life, Hermione wasn't afraid of the dark. She was exactly where she was meant to be, beside him, forever. The realization that their bond was now a choice rather than a shackle did not immediately erase the ghosts that haunted the corridors of Malfoy Manor. The transition from enemies to lovers was not a smooth glide, but a series of breathless, staggering steps. As the 3rd month dawned, the ministry's pressure faded, replaced by a quiet domestic intensity that was, in many ways, more terrifying than the threat of losing their magic. Hermione sat in the sunroom, the morning light catching the gold band on her finger. It no longer pulsed with a sickly violet light. It was warm, a steady hum that felt like a second heartbeat. Across from her, Draco was reading the Daily Prophet, though he hadn't turned the page in 20 minutes. The emotional seesaw had slowed, but the momentum of their history still carried a heavy weight. "You're thinking about the ceremony," Draco said, not looking up. "I'm thinking about the name," Hermione corrected softly. "I spent my whole life being Hermione Granger. Then I was the Shafiq heiress. Now I'm supposed to be a Malfoy. It feels like I'm being overwritten, Draco. One layer of ink on top of another until the original page is gone." Draco closed the paper and leaned forward. The cold was gone, replaced by a grounded, solid presence. "The name isn't a cage, Hermione. It's a shield. My father used it as a weapon, but you make it look like something worth having." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The approach was natural now, a reflex. "You aren't being overwritten. You're the one holding the quill. If you want to remain a Granger, then remain a Granger. The magic doesn't care about the syllables. It cares about the soul." This was the trust that had been forged in the ministry's cell. The understanding that he would no longer try to mold her into a pure-blood ideal. But as the day progressed, the doubt crept back in. A delivery arrived at noon. A trunk of Celine Shafiq's personal belongings, recovered from a hidden vault in Switzerland. Among the silk robes and blackened silver jewelry was a diary. Hermione spent the afternoon tucked into the window seat, reading the words of the mother who had given her away. "I see the way Corbin looks at her," one entry read. "He doesn't see a daughter. He sees a vessel for the pact. He sees the Malfoy gold. I have to hide her. I would rather she be a nameless nobody than a queen in a kingdom of ice." The betrayal Hermione felt toward her biological father flared anew. She realized that the golden bond she now cherished had its roots in such transactional cruelty. When Draco found her later that evening, she was staring out at the darkening grounds, the diary clutched to her chest. She was terrified of this, Hermione whispered as he entered. The very thing we're celebrating, this union, was her greatest nightmare. She died trying to make sure I'd never have to look at you. Draco stiffened, the repulsion of his own family history flaring in his eyes. He stayed by the door, the distance between them suddenly feeling like a chasm. Then perhaps she was right. Perhaps I am the kingdom of ice she wanted to save you from. "Don't do that," she snapped, turning to face him. "Don't retreat into the martyr role just because the truth is uncomfortable. The conflict isn't between us anymore, Draco. It's between the people we were born to be and the people we've become." "And who have we become?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "I'm still the son of a man who would have handed you to the Dark Lord. You're still the girl who had to scrub mudblood out of her own skin. We can kiss all we want, Hermione, but the blood in our veins hasn't changed. It's still full of the same old poisons." The cold returned to the room. It was the slow burn in reverse, the realization that love didn't automatically fix the structural damage of their lives. Draco turned to leave, his shoulders tight with the weight of his own self-loathing. "Wait," she called out. He stopped, but didn't turn around. "My mother hid me because she thought the pact was about power," Hermione said, walking toward him. "She thought it was a way to bind two families into a weapon. And she was right. That's what our fathers wanted." She stepped into his space, forcing him to look at her. But they didn't account for the golden bond. They didn't know that magic can evolve. They built a cage, but we turned it into a bridge. She reached out, her fingers tracing the faded dark mark on his arm. He flinched, but she didn't let go. "This doesn't define you anymore, and my birth certificate doesn't define me. We are the first generation of our houses that gets to choose who we love. That's the real inheritance." The warmth that followed was different from the magical heat of the pact. It was a human warmth, quiet and profound. Draco's eyes softened, the silver turning to a gentle grey. He let out a long, shaky breath, leaning his forehead against hers. "How are you always so right?" he murmured. "Practice," she whispered, a small smile breaking through her melancholy. They spent the following weeks preparing for the formalization of the will. The minister returned, but this time he was met with a united front. Hermione didn't sit in the heiress chair. She sat beside Draco, their hands perpetually linked. The emotional dynamics had shifted into a stable, rhythmic harmony. However, one final seesaw remained. On the eve of the deadline, they returned to the Shafiq castle, the place where it had all begun. The black stone felt less like a tomb and more like a challenge. They stood in the grand hall, the minister and the Gringotts goblins waiting to witness the final ritual of the Eterna Pactum. "To seal the line," the goblin croaked, holding out a ritual dagger. "You must spill the blood of the union upon the hearth. Only then will the castle recognize the new masters." Hermione looked at the blade. The repulsion of the old ways hit her with a sudden, nauseating force. This was what she had fought against. This was the pure-blood obsession with blood and sacrifice. "No," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "Hermione," Draco whispered, his eyes wide. "I won't do it," she said, looking the minister in the eye. "If this castle requires a blood sacrifice to recognize me, then it can stay empty. I am not a Shafiq by the laws of ancient cruelty. I am Hermione, and I won't start my life with Draco by spilling more blood in a world that has already seen too much of it." The silence was absolute. The goblins looked outraged. The minister looked stunned. Draco, however, looked at her with a burgeoning sense of awe. "The pact will fail, Hermione," Kingsley warned. "You'll lose the status. You'll lose the castle." "Let it fall," she said. She turned to Draco, her heart pounding. "I'd rather live with you in a cottage in the middle of nowhere than in a palace bought with a ritual I despise. Do you trust me?" Draco didn't hesitate. The trust was a solid, unbreakable thing. He stepped forward and took the dagger from the goblin's hand, but instead of cutting himself, he threw it into the hearth. "I choose her," he said, his voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room. "Not the gold, not the title, her!" For a heartbeat, the magic of the castle screamed. The shadows writhed, and the violet light of the contract flared to a blinding, angry white. The seesaw had reached its ultimate tipping point. It felt like the world was ending. And then the light changed. The white fire turned to gold. It didn't burn. It bathed the room in a gentle, radiant glow. The golden bond between Hermione and Draco reached out, touching the walls, the floor, and the very foundations of the estate. The magic didn't break. It surrendered. It recognized a power greater than the pact, the power of a choice made in defiance of the law. The castle didn't collapse. Instead, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere vanished, replaced by a feeling of light and air. The portraits of the ancestors didn't sneer. They looked on in a stunned, silent peace. The resolution was complete. "It seems," Kingsley said, his voice thick with emotion, that magic can indeed be deceived. Or perhaps it was simply waiting for someone brave enough to change the rules. The goblins muttered but bowed, handing over the keys to the estate. The conflict of the inheritance was over. The slow burn had reached its final permanent flame. When the officials left, Hermione and Draco were left alone in the center of the hall. The moonlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "We're broke," Draco said, though he was grinning. "Technically, by refusing the ritual, we've forfeited the liquid assets. We have a castle and no way to pay for the heating." "We'll manage," Hermione said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I'm quite good at being resourceful. And I hear Malfoy Manor has a very extensive library we can sell if things get desperate." "Over my dead body," he laughed, pulling her closer. The approach was final. They stood in the heart of their new home, no longer tethered by a dead man's will, but by a living promise. "You know," Draco whispered, his lips brushing against her ear, "I never did tell you why I really stayed that night at the ministry." "Tell me," she breathed, "because I realized that even if the magic died, I'd still be able to find you in the dark. You're my North, Hermione. Always have been, I think. I was just too much of a coward to admit it." He pulled back to look at her, his expression raw and beautiful. "I love you. Not because I have to, because I can't imagine doing anything else." Hermione felt the warmth swell until it felt like she might burst. "I love you too, Draco. My monster, my choice." He leaned down, and this time the kiss was slow, deep, and full of the happy ending they had earned. It wasn't the frantic collision of the previous month. It was a conversation, a vow, and a homecoming, all at once. As they moved toward the grand staircase together, the violet mark on their hands finally disappeared entirely. In its place, under the skin, was a faint, shimmering gold line that connected their pulses, invisible to the world, but felt by both. The story of the mudblood heiress and the fallen prince was over. What began was the story of Hermione and Draco, the architects of a new world built on the ruins of the old. The structure had reached its end. The context of the war and the blood pact had been resolved through the development of their mutual trust and the sacrifice of their expected roles. The outcome was a life defined by their own terms. As they reached the top of the stairs, Draco paused, looking back at the hall. "Ready to start the fire?" he asked. "I think we already have," Hermione replied. And as they disappeared into the shadows of the upper hall, the golden bond hummed one last time, a silent witness to a magic that could never be broken, because it had finally been set free. The first weeks of truly shared life at Shafiq Castle were an exercise in learning how to breathe without the weight of an impending doom. The slow burn had reached its steady flame. But as the seasons began to shift toward a biting autumn, the emotional seesaws took on a more domestic, yet no less intense frequency. Without the ministry's shadow or the threat of death hanging over them, Hermione and Draco were left with the most daunting task of all, building a future out of the wreckage of their pasts. The castle was a labyrinth of stone and secrets, much like their relationship. One afternoon, while Hermione was cataloguing the Shafiq library, a task she found both grounding and exhilarating, she felt the familiar pull of Draco's presence. But this time, It wasn't the jagged, desperate yank of the contract. It was a warm, tethered hum in the base of her spine. She looked up as he entered, his silhouette framed by the high, arched windows. He looked different in the soft light of his new home. The sharp, defensive edges of his posture had smoothed, and he no longer wore his black robes like armor. Instead, he wore a simple, dark green sweater that made his eyes look like stormy seas rather than cold flint. "You've been in here for 5 hours," Draco said, his voice dropping into that low, silk-soft register that still made her heart skip. "If you don't come up for air, I'll have to assume you've been absorbed by a sentient encyclopedia." "I'm almost finished with the 16th century," Hermione said, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Besides, someone has to organize this chaos. My father, Corbin, had a truly chaotic filing system." Draco walked over, stopping behind her chair. He didn't touch her immediately, maintaining that approach that was now a delicate dance of respect. "Your father was a man who believed power was found in confusion. He wanted his knowledge to be a maze." He leaned down, his hands resting on the back of her chair, his face inches from hers. The warmth was instantaneous, a sweet, resonant vibration that filled the space between them. "But you're the one who finds the thread, aren't you? You're the one who leads the way out." Hermione turned her head, her nose brushing against his. "And where am I leading you, Draco?" "Anywhere," he whispered, "as long as it isn't back to who I was." The trust in that moment was absolute, a bridge made of shared vulnerability. But as the evening progressed, the seesaw tilted toward doubt. Later that night, as they sat by the massive hearth in the drawing room, an owl arrived bearing a letter with the Malfoy seal. Draco's face went pale, the cold returning to his features like a sudden frost. He read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. "What is it?" Hermione asked, setting aside her book. "My father," Draco said, his voice flat. "He's been granted a conditional release from house arrest for health reasons. He wants to meet. He wants us to come to the manor for a formal dinner to discuss the merging of the lines." The repulsion hit Hermione like a physical blow. The thought of returning to that house, of sitting at a table with Lucius Malfoy and pretending that the last 3 months were a business arrangement, made her blood run cold. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "We've fulfilled the pact. The Ministry is satisfied. We don't owe him anything." "I know," Draco said, standing up and beginning to pace. The restless energy of his earlier weeks returned, his magic flickering in the shadows of the room. "But he still holds the keys to the Malfoy vaults. If I ever want to restore the name to something other than a punchline, I have to play the game, Hermione. I have to show him that I'm not just your pet pureblood." The betrayal of his words stung. Hermione stood up, her eyes flashing with a familiar Gryffindor fire. "Is that what you think this is? A game of optics? I thought we were past the point of caring what your father thinks of our merger." "It's not about what he thinks," Draco snapped, his voice rising. "It's about the fact that I'm a Malfoy, and I won't be the one who lets 6 centuries of history rot because I'm too afraid to face an old man in a wheelchair." "Then go," she hissed, the cold mask clicking into place. "Go back to your manor and your silver spoons. But don't expect me to sit there and watch him look at me like I'm a clever bit of livestock you managed to trap." The conflict intensified. the air between them turning static and sharp. The emotional dynamics were no longer about the magic. They were about the fundamental differences in how they viewed their world. Draco saw a legacy to be reclaimed. Hermione saw a prison to be escaped. He turned on his heel and strode toward the door. "Fine, I'll go alone." "Fine," she shouted after him. The silence that followed his departure was suffocating. The seesaw had swung into a deep, agonizing repulsion. Hermione sat by the fire, her hand moving instinctively to the gold band on her finger. It felt heavy now, a reminder of the names they carried. She realized that the slow burn of their romance was constantly being threatened by the fast-burning resentment of their pasts. The next 48 hours were a repeat of the ministry separation, but worse, because this time the distance was a choice. Hermione stayed in the Shafiq library, burying herself in research, but her magic was frantic. It reached out for him, finding only the cold stone of the castle walls. She realized then that the slow burn wasn't just about the tension of getting together. It was about the tension of staying together when the world tried to pull them apart. She thought about her biological mother, Selene, who had died in hiding. Had she felt this way? Had she loved Corbin once, before the fanatical loyalty to the Dark Lord poisoned him? "I won't be her," Hermione whispered to the empty room. She didn't wait for Draco to return. She took the Floo to Malfoy Manor. When she stepped out of the green flames, the atmosphere of the house hit her. The cold, the history, the scent of expensive incense and old secrets. She followed the sound of voices to the dining hall. She stopped in the doorway. Draco was sitting at the long table, looking stiff and miserable. Opposite him sat Lucius Malfoy, looking older and more frail than she remembered, but with the same predatory glint in his eyes. "And once the Shafiq estates are fully integrated into the Malfoy Trust," Lucius was saying, his voice a raspy shadow of its former self, "we can begin to lobby the Wizengamot for the restoration of the Shafiq estates are not being integrated into anything," Hermione said, her voice ringing through the hall like a bell. Both men turned. Draco jumped to his feet, a mix of warmth and doubt flooding his expression. "Hermione? What are you doing here?" "I'm here to finish the conversation," she said, walking toward the table with a regal confidence that made Lucius's eyes narrow. She didn't look at the old man. She looked at Draco. "I was wrong," she said, her voice softening. "I was wrong to tell you to abandon your name. You're a Malfoy. That's part of who you are." She then turned to Lucius, her gaze icy and unyielding. "But you are mistaken, Mr. Malfoy. This isn't a merger. This is a revolution. Draco and I didn't fulfill the pact to satisfy your ambitions. We fulfilled it to end them. The Shafiq name and the Malfoy name now belong to us, and we will use them to build a world where men like you are footnotes, not architects." The approach was absolute. She walked to Draco's side and took his hand. The moment their skin met, the golden bond flared, a brilliant, defiant light that filled the dark, oppressive dining room. Draco looked at his father, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look for approval. He looked with pity. "She's right, father," Draco said, his voice steady and strong. "The game is over. If you want to be part of our lives, it will be on our terms. No trusts, no lobby groups, just family, or nothing at all." Lucius Malfoy looked at the two of them. the mudblood and his son, and for a moment the mask of the aristocrat crumbled. He saw that he no longer had any leverage. The magic had truly been deceived. It had chosen love over lineage. "Leave us," Lucius whispered, his head bowing. Hermione and Draco didn't wait. They walked out of the manor, through the gates, and into the cool night air. The repulsion of the house faded behind them, replaced by a profound sense of warmth and trust. As they stood on the hill overlooking the estate, Draco pulled her into his arms. The emotional intensity of the confrontation had left them both trembling, but it was a good tremble, the kind that comes from a fever breaking. "You came," he whispered, his face buried in her curls. "I'll always come," she said. "Even when we're fighting, even when the names get too heavy. I'm your anchor, remember?" Draco pulled back, his silver eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "And you're my north. I'm sorry, Hermione. I was trying to save something that wasn't worth saving. You're the only legacy I care about." The slow burn culminated in a kiss that was slow, deep, and tasted of victory. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of the ministry. It was a kiss of partnership. "One more month until the final decree," Draco murmured against her lips. "Then it's official. You'll be stuck with me forever." "I think I can handle that," she smiled. They returned to Shafiq Castle, but this time it didn't feel like a fortress or a maze. It felt like a home. The structure of their relationship had reached a new level of integrity. The conflict of their external identities had been resolved by their internal commitment to each other. As they lay in bed that night, the golden bond humming a soft, peaceful lullaby between them, Hermione watched the moon through the window. She thought about her mother, Selene, and her father, Corbin. She thought about the war and the blood and the lies. But then she felt Draco shift beside her, his arm draping over her waist, his breath steady against her neck. The golden bond wasn't a trap anymore. It was the foundation. The seventh part of their story was closing, and the slow burn was moving toward its final permanent resolution. They had faced the ministry, the magic, and their parents. All that was left was each other. And as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall outside, Hermione Granger, heiress of Shafiq and soon-to-be Malfoy, closed her eyes and finally, truly, fell asleep in the arms of the man she had chosen. The emotional dynamics were settled. The emotional seesaws had found their equilibrium. There were no more questions, only the steady rhythmic beat of two hearts that had become one. "I love you, Draco," she whispered into the darkness. "Always," he replied. The story was reaching its final peak, and the happy ending was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. All that remained was the final sealing of the vow, the final kiss that would mark the beginning of the rest of their lives. The final month arrived with the quiet, devastating beauty of a winter that knew its time was short. The decree of the Wizengamot sat on the mantelpiece of the Shafiq drawing room, its wax seal a dark, final crimson. In 3 days, the clock would strike midnight on the 90-day deadline, and the Eterna Pactum would merge their lives into a single, legal, and magical entity. The emotional seesaw had slowed to a gentle vibration, but the intensity remained, now focused on the sheer gravity of the permanence before them. Hermione found herself standing on the balcony of the North Tower, watching the snow blanket the jagged peaks of the highlands. The repulsion she had once felt for this life had vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth for the man who had walked through the fire with her. She heard the soft click of his boots on the stone before he spoke. Draco didn't need to announce himself. Her magic greeted his with a joyous, shimmering flare. "The minister's owl just left," Draco said, stepping into the cold air beside her. He looked revitalized, the ghost of the boy who had no choice replaced by a man who had made one. "The formal witnesses are set for Friday. By Saturday morning, the Shafiq and Malfoy titles will be unified. You'll be the most powerful witch in Britain, Hermione, even more than you were before." "I don't care about the power, Draco," she said, turning to him. The wind caught her hair, tangling it in the silver buttons of his coat. "I care about the quiet. I care about the fact that tomorrow we can wake up and not wonder if the ministry is going to tear us apart." Draco reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still made her breath hitch. This was the approach, no longer a forced magnetic pull, but a deliberate choice of intimacy. "They can't touch us now. The bond isn't just stable, it's evolved. The healers call it a soul resonance. It hasn't been seen in 300 years. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "But there's one thing left, the final part of the pact, the choice that isn't made for the ministry or the gold." The trust in his eyes was blinding. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. It wasn't the heavy, ostentatious jewelry of the Malfoy vaults. It was a simple band of white gold, set with a single brilliant diamond that pulsed with a soft inner light. "Hermione John Granger," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotional intensity that stripped away the last of his aristocratic armor. "I know we were forced into this cage. I know I was the monster in your story for a long time. But if you'll have me, not as a contract, not as a duty, but as a husband, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret staying." The seesaw tilted one last time, the doubt of her old life clashing with the warmth of her new one. She thought of the girl in the library at Hogwarts, the girl who hated him, the girl who fought for a world that almost let her die. And then she looked at Draco, the man who had defied his father, his blood, and his own pride for her. "Yes," she breathed, a tear tracing a path through the frost on her cheek. 1,000 times, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the golden bond erupted. It wasn't an explosion of violence, but a halo of pure incandescent light that radiated from the tower, illuminating the snowy valley below. The violet mark of the Shafiqs and the emerald mark of the Malfoys didn't just merge, they transformed into a brilliant crystalline white. The pact was no longer a contract, it was a covenant. The slow burn had reached its final beautiful resolution. The night of the final decree was silent and still. The grand hall of Shafiq Castle was filled with the soft glow of floating candles and the scent of winter pine. Kingsley Shacklebolt stood at the hearth, his golden robes shimmering. There were no crowds, no photographers, no prying eyes. Just the two of them, standing before the fire that had seen their greatest battles and their softest surrenders. By the authority of the ancient laws and the witness of the magic itself, Kingsley proclaimed, his voice resonant and deep, "I declare the house of Shafiq and the house of Malfoy unified. Let no man, No law and no ghost of the past sever what the heart has joined. As the magic settled into the stones of the castle, a profound peace descended. The conflict that had driven them, the war of blood versus choice, was over. The structure of the story had reached its final, inevitable outcome. Kingsley stepped back, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "It is finished. You are free." Draco turned to Hermione. The repulsion was a distant memory. The cold was a shadow, long since chased away by the sun. He looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that held any light. "Free," he repeated softly. He reached out, his hands framing her face. The approach was slow, deliberate, and laden with the weight of every moment they had survived. He looked at her lips, then back at her eyes, seeking the final confirmation of her soul. "I love you, Hermione Malfoy," he whispered. "I love you, Draco," she replied, her voice steady and full of a joy she had never thought possible. He leaned down, and their lips met in a kiss that was the definitive, happy ending. It was a kiss that tasted of the years they had lost and the decades they had gained. It was a kiss that held the heat of the library arguments, the desperation of the ministry cells, and the quiet peace of the snowy towers. It was the slow burn finally consuming everything that wasn't love. As they broke apart, breathless and laughing, Draco didn't let go. He pulled her flush against him, his arms a permanent sanctuary. "I believe there's a tradition," he murmured against her ear, "about the master and mistress of the house sharing a dance in the hall." "I don't know how to dance like a pureblood, Draco," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "Good," he said, leading her toward the center of the room as a soft, ethereal music began to drift from the shadows. "I've had enough of pureblood traditions. Just follow my lead, and I'll follow yours." They danced in the flickering light, two figures moving in perfect synchronicity. The golden bond hummed between them, a silent, beautiful melody that would never fade. The names they carried, Granger, Shafiq, Malfoy, didn't matter anymore. They were simply two people who had looked into the abyss and found each other. The emotional dynamics had found their final resting place. The seesaws were still, the conflict was resolved, and the outcome was a love that had been forged in the most impossible of circumstances. As the clock struck midnight, marking the birth of a new day and a new life, Draco stopped in the middle of the hall. He looked at her, his expression one of such raw, unshielded devotion that it made her heart ache with happiness. "One more for the road?" he asked, his eyes dancing with mischief and love. Hermione smiled, pulling him down by his lapels. "One more, and then every one after that." The final kiss was deep, lingering, and full of the promise of a future they had built with their own hands. In the silence of the ancient castle, under the watchful eyes of ancestors who had finally found peace, Hermione and Draco stood together, no longer pawns of a dark legacy, but the masters of their own fate. The story was complete. The slow burn had finished its work. And as the fire in the hearth crackled and settled into glowing embers, the two of them walked toward the stairs, their hands interlaced, the magic wand, and their hearts finally, truly at home. The war was over. The pact was fulfilled. And for the first time in their lives, the silence wasn't a lie. It was the sound of a happy ending. The first winter of their official union did not feel cold. To Hermione, the drafty corridors of Shafiq Castle, once reminiscent of a tomb, now felt like the sturdy rib cage of a living thing, breathing in rhythm with the two souls it sheltered. The 90 days of transition had passed. The Ministry's intrusive observers had retreated, and for the first time in her life, Hermione was not a soldier, a student, or a target. She was simply loved. The final morning of the year broke over the Highlands in a crystalline display of gold and white. Hermione woke to the sensation of a slow, rhythmic warmth thrumming against her back. Draco's arm was draped possessively over her waist, his fingers interlaced with hers so that their matching golden bands caught the early light. The magical tether that had once felt like a shackle had settled into something sublime, a soft, internal melody that told her he was dreaming of her before he even opened his eyes. "Stop thinking," Draco's voice rasped, thick with sleep, as he pulled her closer, burying his face in the curls at the nape of her neck. "I can feel your brain analyzing the thermodynamics of the frost on the window. It's too early for logic, Hermione." She turned in his arms, a soft laugh bubbling up. "I can't help it. It's a beautiful morning, Draco. Our first New Year as us." He opened one eye, the silver depth of it now devoid of the haunted shadows that had defined him for years. He looked at her with a raw, unshielded adoration that still made her heart stumble. "Not us," he corrected softly, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "The Malfoys of Shafiq, the bridge between the world that was and the world we're going to build." The emotional seesaw had finally found its perfect equilibrium. The repulsion of their past had been transmuted into a fierce, protective loyalty, and the slow burn had matured into a steady, roaring fire that warmed every corner of their shared life. They spent the day in a state of quiet, domestic bliss that would have shocked their younger selves. There were no formal galas to attend, no pureblood expectations to meet. Instead, they walked through the snow-covered grounds, the golden bond shimmering between them like a physical thread of light. Draco showed her the spot where he intended to build a sanctuary for magical creatures, a nod to her heart's oldest passions, while Hermione spoke of turning the West Wing into a centre for Muggle-born integration, funded by the very Shafiq gold her father had intended for darker purposes. The conflict of their heritage had been resolved not by erasing their blood, but by mastering it. They were the architects of a new legacy. As evening fell, the castle was bathed in the warm glow of 1,000 floating candles. They dined in the small morning room rather than the cavernous hall, preferring the intimacy of a circular table where their knees could brush and their hands could remain joined. The dinner was not a performance. It was a conversation that spanned hours, filled with the tense dialogues of the past, replaced by the effortless flow of two minds that had finally found their match. "Do you ever miss it?" Draco asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "The simplicity of hating me, the safety of the labels we used to wear?" Hermione reached across the table, squeezing his hand. The trust was absolute. "Never. Hating you was exhausting, Draco. Loving you feels like coming home after a very long war." He stood up and offered his hand. "Then let's celebrate the peace." He led her to the grand balcony overlooking the valley. The sky was a velvet tapestry of stars, and the air was silent, save for the distant crackle of the hearth behind them. Draco pulled her flush against his chest, his cloak wrapping around both of them like a cocoon. The approach was final. There was no space left between them, physically or magically. "I have a gift for you," he whispered. "Something the Ministry couldn't give us, and the Pact couldn't force." He raised his wand, and with a graceful, silent flick, the sky above the castle erupted. It wasn't standard wizarding fireworks. It was a masterpiece of transfiguration. Golden otters and silver dragons danced across the stars, weaving together in a celestial ballet. They didn't clash. They merged, their tails entwining until they formed a glowing, radiant crest of a new house, a house built on choice. The emotional intensity of the moment was overwhelming. Hermione turned in his arms, her eyes shimmering with tears of pure, unadulterated happiness. The structure of her life had finally found its ending, and it was more beautiful than any story she could have written. "Draco," she breathed. "I told you once that you were my North," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I was wrong. You're the whole map, Hermione. Every path I take leads to you, and I intend to spend every day of our lives making sure you know it." He leaned down, his hands cupping her face with a reverence that made the world fall away. The final shift was complete. The boy who had been a monster and the girl who had been a victim were gone. In their place stood two equals, two lovers, two souls who had conquered magic itself to be together. The kiss was the ultimate resolution. It was slow, deep, and tasted of the future. It held the promise of the children they would raise in a world without prejudice, the libraries they would fill, and the quiet mornings they would share. It was a kiss of profound warmth, a sealing of a vow that required no blood and no contracts. As they broke apart, breathless and smiling against each other's lips, the golden bond hummed a final triumphant note. The snow began to fall again, light and airy, dusting their shoulders like powdered diamonds. "Happy New Year, Hermione," Draco whispered, his eyes bright with love. "Happy New Year, Draco," she replied, pulling him back down for one more kiss. The story ended not with the closing of a door, but with the opening of 1,000 possibilities. The Shafiq castle was no longer a fortress of the past. It was a beacon for the future. And as the two of them walked back into the warmth of their home, hand in hand, the shadows of the war finally retreated into the night. They had deceived magic, defied their fathers, and rewritten their blood. And in the end, they had found the only thing that was ever truly pure, each other. The happy ending was not just a conclusion, it was a beginning.
This was a journey about blood and choice. Sometimes we feel trapped by our past. We feel like our names or our families decide who we are. But Hermione and Draco showed us something different. They showed us that the law is the strongest magic of all. It can turn a cage into a home. It can turn an enemy into a soulmate. I wanted to write a story where the characters change. They start with hate, but they end with truth. Life is not always easy. Sometimes it's like a seesaw, up and down, warm and cold. But if you find the right person to hold your hand, if you can survive any storm, I hope you enjoyed the slow burn and the happy ending. Everyone deserves to find their golden bond. Thank you for spending your time with me and these characters. Until next time, keep believing in magic and more importantly, believe in your own power to choose your path. Goodbye for now.